Hi, everybody. My name is David Robinson. I am the Director of Membership and Meetings for the Linguistics Society of America, which is sponsoring this webinar. If you don't mind, we'll just wait a few more minutes for the rest of our attendees to log in, and then we'll get started. Thanks. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name is David Robinson. I am the Director of Membership and Meetings for the Linguistics Society of America, the LSA, which is sponsoring this webinar. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. And I hope you and your loved ones are all safe and healthy. While I'm talking, you'll be seeing a brief slideshow about the LSA and what we do. You'll also see some information about a special membership discount for participants in this webinar. We're excited to present this webinar on centering linguistic diversity and justice in course design. It's the first in a planned series of webinars on racial justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the linguistics curriculum. We're grateful to our panelists for taking the time to participate, and again to you for being here. I'd like to take just a few minutes to go over the GoToWebinar control panel for you and to let you know how the webinar will work. So first of all, if you'd like to download copies of the panelists' slides, you will find those in the handouts section of your GoToWebinar dashboard. And we'll also make them available on the LSA website once the recording of the webinar is posted. You may also have noticed that your microphones are muted. That is so we don't get all your miscellaneous background noise, but we do encourage you definitely to ask questions at any time. There's a questions widget that you can, on your GoToWebinar dashboard, that you can use for this purpose. And I will forward these to the panelists in the order that they're received, and they'll answer them during the last half hour of the webinar. And also, if your question is for a specific panelist, please mention that in your question. Finally, we have just a few quick polls to give our panelists a better idea of who you are and why you're here. I'm going to run them. Just take about 30 seconds, if you would, to answer them, and then I will make the results visible to everybody. So the first one is asking, what is your academic status? So doing that now. So we'll take just a few more minutes to get the last votes. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this and should be sharing the poll results with you. 28% are students, 4% are postdocs, 17% are tenured track faculty, 41% are tenured faculty, and 9% are not in academia. So I'm going to just launch the next poll real quickly. That's what is your location? This should be an easy one to answer. So go ahead and answer that if you would. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll, and now I will share the results with everyone. So it looks like we are pretty overwhelmingly from North America, with a little representation from South America, Africa, and Asia/Oceania. So I'm going to hide this poll and then just open the last one, which asks, what is your motivation for attending this webinar? So there we go. And this one you can answer more than one. So answer all that apply. Okay, going to close this one. And here are the results. Again, 78% general practices, 72% looking for tips and tricks, 73% syllabus design, 78% general personal interest, and 16% other. So I will hide this. I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn the floor over to Miranda McCarville of Smith College, who is our moderator. So Miranda, take it away.
Hello, welcome. Thank you, David. I'm going to introduce our two panels today. First, we have Savithry Namboodiripad. She's an assistant professor in the Linguistics Department at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and director of the Contact, Cognition, and Change Lab. She earned her PhD from the University of California, San Diego, and her BA and MA from the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on how language ideologies and use interact in multilingual contexts to shape patterns of language change. And she uses experimental methods to study contact and variation in flexible constituent order. Our second panelist today is Nathan Sanders. He is an assistant professor teaching strain in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Toronto. He works on innovations in linguistic pedagogy and on addressing equity, diversity, and inclusion in the linguistics classroom. Along with Jeff Punske and Amy Fountain, he is the co-editor of Language Invention and Linguistics Pedagogy, a recent volume on using constructed languages as a teaching tool in linguistics. His linguistics research centers on biomechanics and perception for both speech and sign languages. He also works on phonological theory, computational and statistical models of linguistic phenomena, language change, and linguistic typology. I will turn it over to our first speaker, Savithry.
Thank you so much, Miranda, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to do this. I hope that this will be helpful and exciting for us as we're all in these final pushes to prep our courses for this wild upcoming semester or quarter for all of us. All right, so I am going to play my slides. One moment, please. All right. So thanks again to everyone for being here. Today, I want to focus on a few different sort of high-level conceptual things, and then what I'm going to do is talk about how I've applied these high-level conceptual ideas to a specific class. And I want to do it that way because I think a lot of us end up in this type of situation that I was, where you're sort of inheriting a class, you're like, okay, I have to teach this one topic now in the fall, and thinking about how we want to sort of shift or change the focus of these courses that we inherit or that are part of our general curricula. to focusing on and centering racial and linguistic diversity, racial justice and linguistic diversity is a situation that we're all in. So I want to sort of focus around that. All right, so, and my focus again is going to be on intra-lee courses today. So I'm using the example of specifically a 100 level, no prereq language acquisition course that's taught regularly at University of Michigan. The vast majority of these students are non-majors and first or second year undergrads. And so the really general, like the even more general principle is that I want to think about how I'm designing my courses around answering the question, what should every student who walks away from a linguistics class know? And what should every person know about language is another way of saying that. And so the first pillar of this is debunking myths and addressing harmful common misconceptions. So this is something that I center my courses around. And so first I'm going to talk about some topics. I'm just going to go over the topics. You'll see a lot of citations underneath. That's more for your own like benefit. I'm not going to like go through and read every single one or go through them. And of course, none of these are exhaustive. These are just the types of readings that I've assigned or used or found useful in guiding my thinking around how to teach about this stuff. So in every single course, including this language acquisition course, I cover sign languages and American Sign Language, particularly because I'm thinking from a North American or US context. And particularly also the cultural appropriation of and language deprivation associated that a lot of deaf people in the U.S. Experienced for structural reasons. So this is the topic that I cover in every single class. In addition, I cover eugenics and race science and the history of linguistics. And this is also something that, you know, again, covering in every single class, and we can think about how it actually relates to a lot of different topics that we might talk about. Another one is deficit models towards multilingualism, especially towards racialized groups and racial linguistic ideologies. And so I have a few references there that have been really helpful for me. And finally, assimilationist policies against, or not finally, second to last, assimilationist policies against First Nations, boarding schools, and language reclamation. And here I want to highlight like that the videos that we use, we try to focus on videos produced by natives for non-natives, that we're not, you know, we're thinking about what the intended audience is of the text that we're using. And finally, African-American languages, and particularly Sandra Lanehart's intro to her book on this has been really helpful and really accessible for students, and a variety of other sources as well. So I just wanted to, that was kind of quick, but I wanted to go through those and give you some examples of the types of texts that I've used in thinking about this. But these are topics that we can really incorporate into every class, no matter what it is, from language acquisition to experimental syntax to anything else. And I'm just using those as examples of courses where I've done it. And so when thinking about, you know, the types of topics and texts and sources to include, right, this is not a new idea, but I just want to state it. I try to focus on, or it's a good idea to focus on videos, articles of all types, including academic articles, popular press articles, blog posts by scholars of all types, in which speakers, community members share their own scholarship, stories, experiences, and ways of thinking and knowing. So this is something that I really try to guide, again, like at a high level when deciding what types of texts to use. And one thing that I really want to highlight is that students consistently list these as among the most significant things they learn in my courses. And these topics are also consistently mentioned as topics which they've not encountered before. So, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about this a little bit later, but it's a really good idea to ask your students these questions, right? Like, what is the most significant thing or things that you learned in this course? What did you learn? What was new to you? And so I always ask that, and these topics always come up over and over again as topics. And was true at UC San Diego, where I taught before as a graduate student, and here at University of Michigan as well. And so, right, this is obviously not an exhaustive list of what should be covered, and I hope that it doesn't come off that way, but I'm really prioritizing topics that students tend to be miseducated about. Topics that have policy implications, so things that might be on the ballot or like a political party's platform, and especially what will resonate with students coming from linguistically minoritized backgrounds. And I also, just thinking about course design, I include these topics in the learning objectives on the syllabus and in major assessments. So in my language acquisition class, along with knowing what the 2-word stage is, you also have to know about language deprivation and, you know, what deaf activists have said about baby sign, right? And this is really very much on purpose. This is a way of demonstrating that they are core and making sure that we're sort of matching our values with our assessments. Thinking about centering topics, so that's like the next little pillar here. So the way that I just want to define what I mean by this. So it's to think about traditionally excluded languages, communities, scholars, and disciplines in conjunction with teaching core concepts. So the big idea is to use this as a way of, as the way of introducing things, not just being a week at the end when we talk about something like multilingualism. So that's my example. So avoid sticking peripheralized topics such as language development and multilingual context on their own at the end of the term. So we can teach about phonological learning in monolingual and multilingual context at the same time, okay? And I also want to really highlight, Kendra Calhoun just gave a great talk about this, specifically with Black languages and culture, focusing on Black languages and culture at the 2nd annual Advancing African American Linguistics Conference. And she has a forthcoming paper in language about it too. So, again, like this isn't unique to me, but hopefully it's helpful to think about as we're thinking about what the, how we're at a high level thinking about redesigning courses. And so now I want to focus on centering topics and what that looks like in Intro to Language Acquisition. So just picking this specific example. So I start and end with this particular paper by Annette Karmeloff-Smith. And first of all, I just want to say, like, it's really cool, especially when you're teaching intro level students about how to read academic articles, to start off with a paper and have them read it again later on, because it's really rewarding. Like, they feel really cool. Like, look at how much I learned. I understand this better. And I think it's like a good lesson. It's fun for me to see, look at how much more you understand now that we've gone through the course. So that's sort of an aside. But I use this paper because it sets up theoretical approaches which are relevant throughout the course. The main points are accessible with guidance. And also it's about Williams syndrome. So starting out the course with a paper on this topic, like, I'm not letting myself off the hook, and we're not letting the field off the hook, and I'm not letting the students off the hook, and making it easy to push things like so-called atypical development to the margins. And so then this paper becomes a reference point throughout the semester. So as we're learning about other things and other topics and studies that are taking place in more, amongst more like typically developing populations, we can think about, well, how does this fit in, right? And we have that paper as a shared common ground and reference point. Multilingualism, as I said before, is discussed from the beginning as the norm, which, us linguists know that it is, but a lot of times, especially, not to pick on language acquisition, there's a lot of great research on multilingual language acquisition, but a lot of times the way that it's taught in intro courses, it does get pushed aside. I give examples from multilingual context whenever possible throughout the term. And some topics, including MLU, mean length of utterance, are discussed in multilingual context before being discussed in monolingual contexts. When we talk about the acquisition of complex morphosyntax and semantics, I use this great paper by Professor Lisa Green, and also another paper by Green and Roper. And both these papers about child and language acquisition of the African American language. And this particular paper is really great because it also discusses African American language more generally. which is the perfect for the context of this course, because that's not like a huge topic. I want them to know about it. And a lot of students, they say, I never knew about African American language coming in. So I want to make sure that that's part of what they're learning, but also that, you know, that it's woven into the structure of the course. So it's not like set aside. That's the way we teach about complex morphosyntax and semantics. When discussing language socialization and language in schooling, I assigned week 2018, which discusses these topics in the context of CASCA language revitalization programs in the Yukon. And instead of having like an ASL acquisition day where we say, hey, sign languages are required just like spoken languages, which is important for students to know, and students will walk away knowing that, I weave examples from ASL throughout the semester to talk about a variety of things, right? Articulatory pressures on acquisition, the types of words which are learned earlier or later cross-linguistically, and so on. And, you know, it's nice to come back to just a few languages as examples. So I think focusing on languages that are locally relevant is really good. And I also use Malayalam, the language I grew up speaking as well. You know, you might be like, oh, ASL is used a lot. Well, this reflects the literature that I'm familiar with. That's like what my master's thesis had to do with. So that's, you know, there's also our own individual things that we're comfortable with as well, of course. And when we're thinking about centering topics, some things that I try to aim for, and I don't know that I always do it perfectly, but what I'm trying to go for is to not use these languages just to talk about the discrimination that the communities who use those languages face. Although I do include the information about that in the context of common myths and common harmful misconceptions. And trying really hard to highlight scholars, academic and non-academic, who are members of these communities in the readings, videos, and guest speakers, and also compensating appropriately. And also something that I'm really bad at, but I want to just remind all of us that we should do more, is to tell untenured or precariously employed folks if you're using their work or including their work in your syllabi. So that's something that I need to do better about for sure. Okay, so the next pillar, I'm just checking time here. All right, is broadening the scope. So I just want us to think about what are we including and excluding as linguistics in the linguistics curricula. And I'm encouraging all of us, and this is something that our department is doing right now, is to think about what classes are required in our programs and which are optional. And it's really the case, I think, that our curricula reflect our values. So there's a lot of important and relevant work being done in linguistics departments. And many of those studies and those ways of thinking that are, and those theoretical approaches that are being developed are directly relevant to questions of racial justice, linguistic justice. And so we're all really, like those of us who are feeling like, oh, I'm having to really learn a lot to be keeping up with this type of literature, we're all dealing with the consequences of historical disciplinary wall building, right? So I'm put historical in there because I'm hopeful that it's going to be historical and that we're all going to work together to break down those walls. And so one thing I want to just remind some of you might have seen, I'm part of a collaboration where we did a survey of linguists and language researchers on a variety of topics. And 40% of our participants have been told that they're not linguists or that their work is not linguistics. And I don't think that that's very much related to this general issue. So I just want us to think about that. I want to bring in that idea as we think about broadening the scope and centering otherwise peripheralized topics. And just to give an example of how these topics all sort of come together, I want to talk about the final paper in my Intro to Language Acquisition class. So in this final paper, students are given several readings. Some are academic and some are like blog posts or popular press articles written by academics, and some are popular press articles written by non-academics. And they're asked to summarize and evaluate the issue of the word gap in a short essay. So they're not asked to take sides, but to summarize what arguments are being constructed, explain what the different methods are, and compare papers written in different fields and for different audiences. And this is something that we, sort of scaffold throughout the semester as well. And so I want to use this as an example because it centers racial justice issues. It broadens the scope of what we think about when we think about, language acquisition. It addresses harmful misconceptions, which have policy consequences as well. And from a course design standpoint, that's kind of nice because major assessment should hit several of these, goals that we have. And then the final sort of, high level pillar thing is marking the unmarked. And so this is something that is, you can think of it as like, even if you're not able to really redo your entire syllabus before classes start, you can think about and ask students to critically engage with the text in the course, right? So you can ask them to ask questions such as, is this based solely on typical development, right? We can even if we're not reading about that, we can ask about it and problematize that. Ask what methods do they use? Can we use these methods in all languages? What's the background of the authors in all kinds of different ways? What theoretical approach is assumed? Does this still work if we don't make all the assumptions of that approach? How weird are the participants? How wispy are the languages? So wispy is something that Jordan Cederos and I, we just wrote about in a paper that just came out in Language and Linguistic Compass. So we're trying to think of what's the equivalent of weird for languages. And so we came up with written, institutionally supported, standardized, and prestigious. So are these, approaches really assuming that languages are looking a certain way? Okay, so now as we wrap up, I want to think, or as I wrap up, I wanted to talk a little bit about building community and sharing resources. And I'm really fortunate that I have a lot of colleagues, student colleagues and professor colleagues in my department who are doing this type of work in their classes, and we're able to share resources. But I do know that a lot of us out there feel really alone in our departments doing this type of work. So I'm hopeful that we can, start to build a community around this and find each other. And so one thing that we thought about when we're thinking about making connections was maybe putting together a listserv. There's also a teaching linguistics LSA special interest group that's getting put together as well. So that's probably another space to find community around this. And so one thing to think about, as you're going through the semester and going through the year and the following years and so on, is thinking about how to evaluate the changes that you made. Like, is it working? Is it really fulfilling the goals that you have set out to achieve? And I again want to say, it's really great to ask, what was the most interesting or significant thing you learned this term to students? And this is something, right, the things I chose to talk about are based on the answers that I've received to that question, but all of these things are, can really change or really should be shaped on what's locally relevant. So I encourage you to ask this question and adjust things according to what's locally relevant in your context. And hopefully we can keep in touch and resource share during this especially isolating time. And then as we're thinking about building community, I also encourage us to think about power dynamics in community building. So are we asking folks who are precariously employed, pre-tenure, graduate students, and historically peripheralized field of linguistics or marginalized backgrounds to suddenly do a lot of uncompensated work to make our courses and curricula better, right? So folks have been doing this work for a really long time, and I've been so fortunate to benefit and to learn from all the people who have been doing this work. And so how is that looking in terms of power dynamics? Are our Black colleagues and students, if applicable, the only ones who are being asked to do this work in the department? So all of this is really, hopefully, we have a lot of webinars coming up. We have a series coming up. All of this is just the beginning, and we all need to do the reading ourselves. And I want to encourage us, especially those of us with more institutional power, to cite, invite, and compensate those of us who are, those of our people in our community who are in different positions than we are. Okay. And then I want to end the very last thing I have to say is some resources. So I'm with Sanja Lanehart, who's at University of Arizona, and Haley Heaton, recent grad from UMich. We put together this crowdsourced like Google Drive we call it Social Justice Ling 101. And so this is a little bit different than the focus of what I just talked about, because this is specifically asking people who have been teaching courses on language discrimination and social justice to share their materials and syllabi. And so these are really difficult and necessary courses to teach. And so community building is really helpful. And also feel free to email me. I'm happy to share materials and also receive feedback, because I'm definitely still learning and still growing. So I would really appreciate any feedback that you all have. And finally, I'm working with Hannah Gibson, Christina Rydell, and Jacqueline Luck on a survey about the state of African languages and epistemologies and linguistics departments and curricula. And this is something I didn't have the chance to touch on because this is something that I need to learn and work on more than myself. So I just want to highlight that. Watch out for it on LinguistList and other listservs. And that is it. I hope I didn't go over time. I apologize.
Let's see. All right. Thanks, Savi. That was great. And thanks, Miranda, for the introduction. And thanks to the LSA for hosting this. So I'm going to be talking about some of the same issues that Savi just talked about, but with a slightly different perspective. This is taking place at the University of Toronto in Canada. Issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion are slightly different in Canada than in the United States. And I'm looking at a project with specific small pieces across many different courses, rather than modifying one big course. So I'm going to talk first about some of the types of language-based biases that we as linguists encounter in the classroom, then give you an overview of the equity, diversity, and inclusion initiative that we have at the University of Toronto, then go through some of the specific components, and then sum up. So some of the biases that we have to deal with. As linguists, we are very aware that many languages and language varieties are marginalized, disadvantaged, stigmatized, and oppressed in many different ways.
Excuse me, Nathan?
Oh, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I think you need to click on a link to start your presentation. It's not...
Oh, it's not showing. Is it showing now?
No, it's showing in like the right third of your screen.
How about now?
I think if you maximize it, that will be...
Is that showing now?
I think we're still seeing the outline view.
Okay.
This is better than it was before, though.
How about now?
It looks the same. I would say we could go with this if we need to.
All right, let me just try one more.
Perfect.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that.
Thanks.
Okay, so here's the roadmap that I just talked about. And so now I'll talk about these language-based biases that we deal with. So as I said, we're very aware that many languages and language varieties are marginalized in different ways. We see this with non-standardized dialects, sign languages, minoritized languages, and indigenous languages. And this is a problem in society at large, but linguists are part of society. And so our field is also influenced by these biases, and they show up at a variety of levels. One of the most important sources of these biases is external institutional bias. So for example, as instructors, we're typically expected to promote some sort of standardized variety of the dominant local spoken language, usually formal academic English in North America. And we have to evaluate student fluency in this dialect. And students who use language varieties that are farther from this idealized language tend to come from populations that are already disadvantaged for other reasons, racism, ableism, classism, and so on. And so imposing these linguistic requirements on them as well adds yet another barrier to their academic success. Furthermore, as individuals who are shaped by this bias society, we are also subject to our own unconscious biases as individuals. So we may commit common linguistic microaggressions, like mispronouncing a minoritized student's name, or misgendering or dead naming a trans or non-binary student. And these kinds of microaggressions can have very severe detrimental effects on a student's mental health and thus on their academic success. So it's important that we be aware of these and try to address them. But then there's also these biases that permeate linguistics as an entire field. So for example, research in many subfields of linguistics has often been historically, and in some cases continues to be, lopsided in favor of a small number of major spoken languages, especially English. And this research bias has created a lens through which all these other languages and their structures are viewed and treated as exceptional, and if they're too exceptional, potentially ignorable. And this is often the case with sign languages, which often don't get much discussion in linguistics courses. Not only do we show bias towards which languages we work on, usually these socially powerful languages, but we also often present example data that reflects and reinforces other types of unjust hierarchies and stereotypes, especially those concerning gender and culture. And many of you are probably aware of recent research on this with respect to gender. So as linguists who are experts on language, we are particularly equipped to know better, so we should do better. And there have been many calls to action for linguists to do better because they're linguists and they should know better. And I've got a list of some of those calls to action here. And this is especially important to remember in the classroom because we are modeling behavior and viewpoints that will be passed on to the next generation of linguists. So if we don't correct for those biases now, they're just going to continue. So in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to offer some concrete ways to address these biases based on an ongoing project at the Department of Linguistics at the University of Toronto. So the initiative itself began a couple of years back. There were discussions with the Sociolinguistics Research Group. I had created a language and social justice course, and through these discussions came this idea to apply for a grant to do equity, diversity, and inclusion work across the entire curriculum and even beyond, to reach out to other departments and other institutions. So I wrote this grant with Karen Rice and Naomi Nagy, and we got a 3-year grant through this Learning and Education Advancement Fund. And what this does, well, I want to highlight this because funding is key. These types of projects can be a lot of work, and as Savi talked about, people who do this work should be appropriately compensated, especially if we're getting graduate students to do this labor. So I want to highlight, be creative in seeking out funding sources to pay for this work. Many faculty who are in research positions at research institutions may not even be aware that their institutions have dedicated funds for teaching and learning. So look into that. Try to find these funds and sources of money for teaching and learning because they do exist. So I've got funding through this project for 3 years to pay for 2 full-time graduate student positions for 2 semesters each year. And the first 2 graduate students that I've been working with are Lex Canelli and Pacholo Umbal. And oops, he's got an extra L in his name. There's only one. And they have done a fantastic job this past year, and they're continuing on to the project in its 2nd year, and I'm really lucky to be able to continue working with them. So the main big picture goals of this project are to raise awareness of these language-related biases that I talked about explicitly in the course content as something for the students to learn and be assessed on. To diversify the data away from the usual suspects, so not English, not German, but starting to collect data and present data to students from other languages and other modalities. Also working on how to create a more inclusive and welcoming learning space for the students. Build a repository of these resources and tools so that instructors around the world can use them, and to bring in guest speakers because we can't do this alone. We're not fully competent in every aspect of EDI issues. So the first year of this project, our primary strategy was to collaborate with specific instructors for 2 courses per semester to work on individualized approaches for their class that suited their needs without having to radically reinvent their syllabi, while also satisfying the goals of this project. And then in parallel, we also worked on other aspects of the project behind the scenes. Okay, so the 5 components. The first one was course content. And so one of the courses we worked on was my own introductory phonetics course. And in this course, what we worked on was expanding the content of course material in 3 weeks, 3 units of the course, to bring out these language-based biases explicitly as content that the students were had to learn and would be assessed on in homework and exams. So one of the first pieces of course content we adapted to this project was in the unit on modeling vowel acoustics. So this is the classic tube models, resonant frequencies, and so on. And what we added was content concerning gender diversity to problematize the notion of a typical male or female vocal tract. And the reason for this is phonetic students are often taught to calculate resonant frequencies using 17.5 centimeters. And this is ostensibly because it is a nice number that evenly divides into the speed of sound, 35,000 centimeters per second. It gives you nice round numbers for your formants. But this length, the 17.5 centimeters, is also often presented as typical or average, or I've even found a case where it was called neutral, and who knows what neutral is even supposed to mean, as a vocal tract length, especially for adult males. Now, this is problematic for a number of reasons. First, it perpetuates male as a default, which is already a problem in the sciences, and it also further masks body diversity within and across genders. It's assuming that you can easily identify a male vocal tract length versus a female vocal tract length. And that's just not the case. There's a lot of variation. So we wrote up new lecture notes for the course. I think 2 full pages, single-spaced, small print about this issue that talks about the problems of using this default, especially with respect to transgender speakers, and how hormone replacement therapy can interact with resonant frequencies and pitch. And we also gave them suggested readings, and we designed homework and exam questions that assess the student understanding of this material. So it wasn't just this side issue that we brought up for them to say, oh, isn't this interesting? But they actually were expected to know it and understand it and work with these concepts. The second piece of course content that we adapted was in the unit on auditory perception. So the original course notes that I designed basically talked about the physical mechanics of auditory perception, how resonance operates in the ear, what goes on with the eardrum and the bones in the ear. And we added content about how social biases have an effect on perception as well. And so what we find is that there are many effects that go beyond just the pure physical mechanics of perception that are about social information. So we wrote new lecture notes just like we did with gender, and designed assessment as well. And we focused on a particular study that showed that native speakers of Canadian English are perceived as less intelligible if their faces are visible and their face is looks Chinese. And that this effect completely goes away if it's white speakers and when the Chinese faces are hidden. So this is a really interesting effect that if you just hear the audio, people say that they're equally intelligible, but as soon as you show the faces, the voices coming from Chinese faces are deemed less intelligible. And so we focused on this as some of the evidence of how social information can bias perception. And we particularly noted how this is important for students to really understand that perception's not just this objective mechanical fact about the body, and it can have important consequences in the real world, such as how a student might subconsciously rate racialized instructors as worse than white instructors because they're less intelligible. The final piece of course content that we changed was in the unit on sign language phonetics, which itself I had added to the course a long time ago. And we added explicit content about how sign languages are often minimized or excluded in linguistics, so to make it clear why we're even talking about this. And it's because spoken languages are the assumed default. Linguistics courses are regularly taught with little or no significant discussion of sign languages, but analogous linguistics courses with no significant discussion of spoken languages are rare. And when they do exist, they're overtly marked with sign language. So you have sign language syntax in contrast to the unmarked syntax. And that's something we wanted to address explicitly and say this is a problem. We shouldn't be assuming that spoken language is the default modality. We find, undergraduate linguistics majors might not even ever work with any sign language data at all. That's something that you can easily imagine happening in a typical linguistics major. But the reverse is just sort of unconscionable, to have an undergraduate major only ever work with sign language data. And so this is something we wanted to question. Why is there this asymmetry in how these two modalities are taught? And especially because this can have effects on how sign languages and deafness are treated. That by doing this without addressing it, we're implicitly minimizing or just ignoring them, implying that deaf people themselves can be ignored, which mirrors society at large. For example, we see that American Sign Language and Quebecois Sign Language are not recognized as official languages of Canada. And further, by focusing on spoken languages, the field of linguistics misses out on a huge amount of relevant knowledge from other modalities. If we're only looking at a piece of the picture, we can't really say what language does. We're talking only about spoken language if we only look at spoken language. And many linguists will often behave as if knowledge isn't necessary or important, and they'll make broad claims about what language does or what language looks like. And what they really mean is what spoken language does. because they haven't even checked to see what sign languages do. So a second component of this was to diversify the data. We worked with Professor Peter Jurgits in his introductory phonology course in the same semester, fall 2019. And our focus here was to replace or supplement data from major standardized European languages that are the typical sources of data that we find in linguistics courses. So we created some new phonology data sets from Cantonese, Sundanese, and Tagalog, as well as some demonstrating sociolinguistic variation for lesser studied language varieties like Faroese, Gunloal Ersu, and Toronto Heritage Russian. The third component was we organized workshops with instructors and teaching assistants in both of those two courses to discuss best practices for teaching a diverse student body. At the University of Toronto in particular, we have a large international student body, a lot of students from East Asia. So there's a lot of non-native speakers of English coming in. And so we want to talk about how to work with this population. We focused on general social respect for students, so their gender, their name, making sure that these are things that that the TAs and instructor are thinking about from day one about how to be inclusive and welcoming to students from a variety of different backgrounds. But we also want to make sure that this broad linguistic background that we have among the students can be leveraged to empower students as language experts. And this is something that linguists are usually pretty good about, but we want to make sure, especially for the newer TAs, that this is something that they're consciously thinking about, how to approach students and say, you know, you speak Hindi, you're an expert. I know nothing about it. You're the one who knows everything. So tell me, what does Hindi do? The fourth component is an online repository where we'll store all of these materials for use. That we haven't started developing yet. But in addition to the various notes and data sets and homework assignments, we also want to build some databases, such as a database of names. So these names come from a variety of languages and cultures, categorized by gender across 3 different categories, and that we're going to confirm these with native speakers, make sure that indeed Anawea is thought of as a feminine name in Hawaiian, and so on. And so we're working on developing this database. This is to help, you know, get rid of all the John saw Mary and John gave Mary a book and Alice, Bob, and Carol went to the store. Get rid of all of those and start, you know, spicing up our examples so they're more reflective of the diversity of the languages we work on. We also similarly want to build a database of predicates and sentence frames categorized by argument structure and other relevant syntactic and semantic properties. And mostly we want to avoid the more problematic, offensive types that linguists often gravitate to, violence, gender stereotypes, and so on. The fifth component, the last component, is bringing in expert guest speakers. And our first one is Professor Ann Charity Hudley, who is going to speak to us in October. And we're really excited about having Professor Charity Hudley come because her work has been a huge inspiration for this project at the beginning and in my own work on these issues. So final thoughts, time management and advanced preparation is a huge piece of this. For something like this larger project that we're working on, we found that the fall semester went pretty smoothly because we had the summer to work on ideas, but second semester was rough. The time between semesters just wasn't sufficient to do the work we needed to do to prepare. So the concluding thought to that is plan out the entire year as much as you can if you're doing something this large. Now, obviously, most of you aren't going to be doing a project like this, but you'll be a piece of something. And so that's not as crucial for you. The nature of the course matters. We started off by just ignoring sociolinguistics and field methods courses because the content is already naturally predisposed to discuss these sorts of issues. We wanted to focus on courses where it's not at all obvious how social justice and diversity plays a role, such as in phonetics. You know, we all have bodies and they're basically the same. How can social justice be important there? And so that's what we wanted to target, was these courses where it wasn't immediately obvious how to do this work. Phonology was pretty easy to work on. Syntax was hard, and semantics is even harder because it's often the language of instruction is also the target, the object language for analysis, and that can be difficult for L2 learners. We're still working with Professor Guillaume Thomas on how to address this issue. How do you teach semantics so that it's not English-centric? And expertise matters. The three of us working on this are much more comfortable in phonology and phonetics, so that went much smoother. Buy-in matters. You want the instructors to care, and luckily we had instructors and an entire department who cared and are supportive. So I've tried to present a basic model of how you can combat the various language-based biases I talked about in the classroom in small ways. And I hope that some of these components can help inspire you to make the same kinds of changes that we did in your own classes or even across your entire department. Final caveat, we don't have all the answers. We're not infinitely expert people on these topics. There are pieces that we're missing, and there's some we're probably getting wrong. There's countless different ways that bias can show up, and therefore countless ways to solve it. No one person or group can do this perfectly. This is a communal effort. All of us must work together and contribute and support each other. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. And now we have come to the part of the webinar where the panelists will take your questions. So if you haven't already asked a question, you can do that using the questions widget on your GoToWebinar dashboard. I will forward the questions to the panelists, and our moderator, Miranda McCarville, will ask them, will pass them on to the panelists. So Miranda, take it away.
Thank you. So our first question is for Savi. And the asker wanted to know, when you say tell untenured people that you're using their work, do you mean their syllabus design, course activity ideas, or their papers that you're citing? And then they have a follow-up question on, have you ever designed a course around a textbook?
Both great questions. So the answer to the first one, I meant specifically when you're including people's like publications and other types of publications in your syllabi, but I don't know, because I have not gone through the tenure process yet, whether other types of things like course design or things like that that are less like citable or point toolable, like how those get counted. And I imagine there's a lot of variance across departments or universities. Maybe it is a good idea to tell them no matter what, so that we can keep a note, or whoever can keep a note of it. But that's sort of a greater question that I don't have the answer to. Okay, that's the first one, was what to ask. And the follow-up was around a textbook. Okay, yes, this is such a good question, because so my class, I ended up not using a textbook and this language acquisition course. And the reason why is because I wanted to do all the things that I ended up doing. And there are some language acquisition textbooks that I like. I've TA'd for courses that used them and it went well, but at least in that area, I haven't found one that fit these requirements for me. So one thing that I've been thinking about is using textbooks selectively, or maybe even scrambling the order of stuff, because I think even the order in which we present these things can be meaningful or helpful. But I think, the textbook thing is hard. I generally don't use textbooks because for sort of personal not wanting to ask students to buy textbooks reasons, but I know that it is, especially when you're teaching a lot of courses and you have a heavy course load, it's easy, I understand why. So anyway, that's my general thought about that, but hopefully that was helpful.
Nice. Let's see here. Our next one is How can we balance teaching specifics about sign language without leaving too much behind for the spoken languages? Specifically, they say they're thinking about explaining phonology. I think this could go to either of you or both.
I can address this. So yeah, it's tough because so I teach phonetics, and traditionally phonetics is spoken language only. You learn the IPA, you learn the layout of the vocal tract, you learn about auditory perception, and that's about all you typically have room for. So when I started teaching, I decided I'm going to incorporate at least one unit on sign language phonetics. So I expect the students to learn the layout of the manual articulators, the difference between non-manual and manual articulators, a little bit about visual perception. So I try to cover an entire semester's worth of content for sign languages in 1 week. Yeah, it's tough to balance this because ideally both modalities would get equal time, but then the students aren't going to get what's expected of them, which is full knowledge of the IPA and knowledge of resonance frequencies and that sort of thing. And that's a tough call to make. I think if you've got more control over syllabus design in your department, where they're not expecting a certain type of knowledge, you could do more sign language phonetics and leave out some of the non-essential spoken language phonetics. But yeah, ideally there would just be 2 semester courses, one for spoken language, one for sign language.
I think I want to quickly add, it depends, right? It depends on a lot of how you frame things. So if you're thinking about like high level, so the way that I include like sign language phonology, you know, in my class anyway, is thinking about like articulatory pressures or like complexity or things like that in production. And that is, I think, pretty easy to weave in and think about, like, you know, along with spoken language. And if you're teaching the higher level, you know, concept, I think you can use examples from different languages. So that's my short response, as not a phonologist orientation.
Yeah, absolutely. I do that as well. So I tie in these notions of articulatory pressures and perceptual pressures and how they play a role in both modalities, but in different ways. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to skip to the next question just because we have a couple people that have asked a few, and I'd like each novel person to get a chance. The next one I think is a nice short one. It's called "What are weird participants?" The acronym from Savi's.
I should have cited that. I actually went back and forth. So this is from, oh my gosh, I'm not going to remember. It's Heinrich et al., but I don't remember who the other people are in the paper, and it's about psychology experiments particularly. So WEIRD is an acronym standing for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And it's a way to describe the types of people who are typically included in psychology experiments. Mm-hmm. And so the really important thing, and the thing that I think is really crucial for us as linguists, right, is that a lot of psychological processes, like vision things, like were thought to be universal, and it's actually not universal if you look beyond that type of population. Yeah. And so that is like an acronym that's used a lot to be like, oh, we want to unweird things, but it's about the people, and that's why we wanted to think about in our paper about the languages. Anyway, yeah, because you could be weird and also speak a minoritized language, right? So anyway, yeah. And the other thing that's important is that weird often means white. So that's also really important as well. So weird is racialized. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a question asking, how are these suggestions for curricular review received by colleagues in terms of academic freedom?
I've gotten nothing but positive response and support. I've gotten a lot of buy-in from the members of my department. I think it helps that my position is slightly different than theirs. I'm in the teaching stream. and they're all in the research stream. So they're happy to have me do this kind of curricular work because they don't have to do it directly on this bigger scale because it doesn't count for them the same way it does for me. They're supposed to do research articles and that sort of thing, and I have the freedom to do curriculum development, and that counts for me the same way that a theoretical syntax article would count for research faculty. So my position gives me a lot of privilege and power to do this kind of thing in a way that other faculty wouldn't be able to. So they're happy that I'm doing this, and that I can guide them through and say, I'm going to work with you one-on-one to just make a few tiny changes to your material, and they're happy to do that. So they've been very supportive and responsive. Yeah.
Savi, did you have anything to add, or you? Okay.
Not really. I have, yeah, that's not really part of what we've done. I mean, we're talking about curricular changes in our department at a higher level, like the committee level. So I'm not really going around individually and necessarily canvassing. So I don't have much to say about that.
Thank you. So our next question is addressed to Nathan. Do you have specific suggestions for resources to incorporate a phonetics course on sign language phonetics?
So email me and I can send you my lecture notes. I'm happy to share those. That's my most immediate answer. There's plenty of work out there, but there's not. One of the things that's missing in the sign language literature is an equivalent of Ladefoged's A Course in Phonetics. There just isn't a phonetics Bible for sign languages. There's lots of bits and pieces scattered throughout the literature, and that's something that I've thought about working on and looking into, but for right now, all I have are the lecture notes, which I'm happy to share with anyone. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next one isn't a question, but a point to think about from Sonia Leinhardt. And it says, I think that in implementing change, we need to recognize the 3 levels of oppression that Kevin Kumashiro talks about: individuals, institutional, and ideological. In part, that means understanding our own biases first, and then understanding that in context, affecting change needs to address all 3 levels.
Yeah.
So, wonderful thing to think about.
It's Sanja. Yeah.
Oh, Sanja, thank you. The spelling on the screen is not quite accurate. So to all the panelists, we have another question. It's very difficult to teach syntax or IPA, for example, excuse me, to new undergrad students in an intro to linguistics setting. Have you found that teaching these things in languages other than the language of instruction causes additional pain? Is it worth it? Or I'm adding on, does it actually make it easier for some of them?
So I think this gets at like a bigger question of like, what should our Ling 101 classes look like? And I kind of rushed through. My colleague Ryan Lepik has really thought about this. Like, and I think about this a lot too. In Ling 101, I'm a syntactician. Do I want my students to walk away knowing like the ins and outs of X-bar theory? Or like, do I want them to understand something a little bit more high level about how syntax works? So I think like a bigger question we can ask is like, what is the level of detail? What does it count as like learning like syntax or whatever? Or do I want them to memorize the IPA or understand the organizing principles around it or know how to look it up, right? And so that's my, I don't know if that's dodging the question, but that's like my response to that, I guess. So you're right. I think that it's hard to do all of these things. So some things have to go. And I do think that it's, I haven't found it to be any more or less difficult teaching about these topics in languages other than English myself.
When I teach intro, I do the pretty typical base everything on English in the lecture for the most part, because that's the language that in theory everybody in the classroom understands. But I have been trying to shift away from that, especially in syntax and semantics, one of the things that I've shifted away from is expecting students to provide grammaticality judgments, because not everybody shares those judgments. So I just say, assume these judgments. These are the judgments. And once you start doing that, then it becomes easier to start working with other languages as your data. Because if you're not requiring the students to make the grammaticality judgments, then it doesn't matter. You give them whatever language you want. Yeah, so I use English largely for exemplars, but then I give them data from other languages. For phonetics, it's just English. Maybe, you know, these are my own biases, but English has a nice set of phonemes that work really well for giving a broad picture of the IPA, but also a small enough one that's digestible at the beginning of the course. And then later you can fill in the gaps with the remaining IPA symbols. So that's something to think about. How much of that is genuine about English and how much of it is my own bias view of what looks like a reasonable set of phonemes. Yeah.
Thank you, Nathan. We have a nice follow-up comment to this discussion here that says, I have taught intro courses to linguistics, and I'm not a native speaker of English. And I just wanted to say that discussing languages other than English is a relief sometimes, because when discussing English, students often get skeptical, and I've had cases where students tell me, no, that's not true, even when I had all the evidence. So I think diversifying curricula, as you said, is beneficial for the field in general, because more non-native speakers of English might feel more comfortable teaching general linguistics instead of their language linguistics.
Yeah.
And I think that relates well back to what Nathan had pointed out in his studies about perception of speakers. And we know this does happen with grad student teachers.
Yeah.
Back to my question here. Okay, there. Oops, sorry. You can't use the arrow key on this, I found out. Oh, here's one for anyone. It says, as a graduate student, I'm sometimes told not to focus on DEI issues because it detracts from what should be my main focus. Do you have any tips for how to justify spending effort on these things to advisors, or tips about to report on this work in a way that counts for job applications? So how does that get on your CV? So either one or both.
So this is I could probably talk about, you email me, person who wrote that. I'd be happy to meet with you and talk about that. This is like a hard, really big question. And it doesn't go away. So, you know, that keeps happening after you get a job too, as someone who works on issues now. So that is something that, you know, and it kind of goes back to Sandra's point of like, we have to think about like the institutional biases and the biases at the level of society and ideologies. Like this is a bigger oppressive structure that we're a part of. And so it's hard to think about like what are incentives under an oppressive situation. That's like one way to think about it. But also thinking about like what can you put on your CV as a talk that you gave or a paper that you wrote. There are venues to submit this type of work. And again, I'm happy to talk about like more details about that with you if you would like. But that is also just things to think about, is like how can we really, not just in our curricula, but in our scholarship, deperipheralize this type of work, because it isn't. Right. And that requires a broader social change, as well as individual actions in this context are not going to be the only thing that stops that.
I echo everything Savi said. I mean, it's we're here in Canada, we have these teaching stream positions, which are fairly common and getting more common. So this type of work is actually good for trying to get those kinds of jobs and getting promoted within those jobs. So luckily, this work can be valued. It depends on what kind of job you get into. If you get into a typical research position at an R1 institution, it's going to be a tougher challenge to figure out how to position this work as relevant and valued. I don't have a good answer for that. Yeah.
So we have a quick comment that says, a reminder to the 41% of this audience that's tenured, please try to push for EDI work to count.
Yes.
Yes. So thank you, Catherine Anderson, for that comment.
Yes.
Right. The answer to the question is, I don't know. Yeah, like this is for not wrong audience. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a really good question here. Do you or how do you teach cultural responsibility when discussing or studying non-WISP languages? This is a question more concerning sign languages, since most signers are deaf and thus more subject to ableist, tendencies in studying the sign languages.
Yeah, so I talk about this every time I talk about sign languages in my course. I first point out I'm a hearing scholar. I'm not a member of the deaf community. It's a very weird position to be in because I shouldn't be the one talking about this. Deaf scholars should be talking about it. The problem is, because of structural biases, they're not in positions to teach these courses. And so until that can change, somebody will hopefully teach students about these topics. So I make this point very early on when I talk about sign languages and minoritized languages, indigenous languages, the importance of working with the community and having voices from those communities be prominent and present. And so, as you know, as a white cisgender male hearing scholar, I am not the one who should be talking about these topics, but somebody has to. And until we can make those changes in hiring practices and representation, I'm doing what I can.
Wonderful, thank you. I have another question here. Is there, Nathan specifically, is there anything you do at the beginning of class to know what languages the students speak? In this question asker's experience, students really appreciate seeing examples from their own languages.
So usually what I do in the first tutorials, the discussion sections, I have the TAs ask students what languages do they speak at home, what other languages are they familiar with, and so then we go through that and we use that as a way to gauge what the range of languages are and what languages we might be able to pull from, either from research or from the students themselves, empowering them as experts.
Wonderful. We have a question from a speaker. This is, they're on a 10-week quarter system. Oh, the quarter system. How can we incorporate these topics and still cover the basics of phonetics, phonology, morphology, and syntax in 10 weeks? Oh, any ideas?
I was also on the quarter system my whole career until now, so
Oh, wow.
I empathize. Yes. So I earlier said about Ling 101. So the person Ryan Lepick, the person who made these changes, he was teaching in a quarter system, so it's possible. And so one thing to think about is like reordering of topics, weaving things in. So I think, again, if you are like, I'm going to do 1 week phonology, 1 week phonetics, 1 week this, and then 1 week, African American languages, then it's not going to be possible because you'll run out of weeks. But if you're weaving things in, that is possible, and reordering topics. So one thing that Ryan talks about is like starting out with sociolinguistics, for example, as like an entryway, and that's like the type of thing that Kendra Calhoun also talked about in her talk. So it's definitely, and they're also on the quarter system. So yes, it is challenging, and like I said before, sometimes you might have to let go of certain types of detail because time is finite, but yes, just some strategies, but I'm happy to talk about that more, or again, if you email me, I can send you syllabi.
Thank you. Now we have somebody that asks, what tips do you have for getting students into activism for linguistic justice, beyond just raising their awareness in the classroom?
So I do a project in my language and discrimination class, which I didn't talk about today. I do a project which has been really amazing and really inspired students to take action on their own, which is, so it was a linguistic discrimination project. So we had students investigate an example of linguistic discrimination on campus or in the surrounding areas. And it was powerful. It was hard. They learned about, research methods, but they loved it so much, and it really led them. And so we talked about, okay, like, is this something that could have maybe a policy change at the university? So one issue was trans students getting misgendered. And so students were talking about how a lot of trans students had low information about the fact that they could change their pronouns on their, on the course management, and professors themselves didn't know either. So we sent a letter to the dean and was like, hey, maybe this should be part of the, anyway, so there's things like that that I think getting students to see these issues in the communities that they're in, especially affected students, like, once you show students, like, this is what's going on, here's names for these things, like, they're coming in with this expertise because they are experiencing it themselves. And then all we have to do is sort of give them the tools and direct them to the right places to, affect change. So doing something like that, that's sort of student motivated, I don't know, whatever. Anyway, that's, I think, a really good way of doing that. I'm sure there's other things out there as well, but that's something that's worked for me.
Yeah, I don't have a specific tips, but I teach a language and social justice seminar for first-year students, and I love being able to teach this because I'm getting students coming in fresh from high school who are still holding on to a lot of linguistic prejudices and biases, especially with regards to prescriptive grammar. And I find so many of them come out of that course saying, I'm so glad I took this course. I have been a horrible person, making fun of people for their bad grammar, and or alternatively saying, I'm glad to have my language and linguistic identity validated by this course because I've been made fun of throughout my life for speaking broken English or bad dialect. One of the projects I do in that course is for them to reflect on a time when either their language usage was mocked in some way, or they mocked someone else. And I do this later in the course and say, what was wrong with that scenario? And if you were the one doing mocking, have you changed your opinion on what you were mocking? And invariably, when they say that they were the one doing the mocking, they say, and now I feel really bad about it. So I think just opening their eyes up to these issues is a huge step because a lot of them are self-motivated to make those changes once they find out because many of them aren't even aware of these issues. So just opening their eyes is huge. Yeah. Another thing that I do when I talk about the bias against sign languages in linguistics is I say, challenge your professors. If they're talking about this is what language does and this is what language looks like, but they're basing it on spoken language, call them out or question them. Say, well, what about sign languages? So I encourage them to push this issue in their later courses.
Thank you, Nathan. I think we have time for one last question.
If you don't mind, Mike, stepping in, it's David. I just wanted to say if we started a few minutes late, so if the panelists and the interpreters are okay with going on, maybe 5 or 6 minutes past 2:30, I think we're fine with that. So okay. Sorry, take it away, Miranda.
I'm fine with it as long as our interpreter is okay with it. Perfect. So the question now we have is, Nathan, how do we balance treating students as experts and putting students on the spot to be representatives for a language that they may not necessarily want to?
Yeah, so this was an issue that came up in these conversations. So, first of all, don't call on them. Don't say, hey, you're the Hindi speaker, tell us about Hindi, but ask them to volunteer. And the strategy here is to make it very clear they're the expert, and anything they say is right. I mean, that's they know how their language works because they're the native speaker. And so really trying to make them comfortable in that role. But definitely, don't put them on the spot. Don't pull names from the hat and say, let's get our native Cantonese speaker to say something about Cantonese. You really have to just volunteer. Now, what you could do is say, does anybody here speak Cantonese natively? Does anybody here speak Arabic natively? So that you can sort of, encourage those students that are in the class to speak up. But I think just straight up, don't point them out. Let them point themselves out.
I have one quick addition, which is something I found helpful is if you can plan ahead, you can send out like a survey to students and ask them ahead of time. Like, we're going to talk about this. Does anyone want to talk about their language? And that's been a really good way of doing it, because then they're prepped coming in sort of emotionally. Because I know like I've gotten put on the spot by a lot of people. So I think that's good too.
I think we have gone through all of the questions from our audience.
Well, so in that case, thank you very much indeed to Savi and Nathan for sharing your expertise with us, and to Miranda for moderating the discussion. Thank you to our interpreters, and thanks to all of you in the audience for taking the time out of your day to be with us. We've had a few requests throughout the webinar, and we'll get those out to you by email pretty soon. Some people have asked for the panelist syllabi, for more resources about the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning Special Interest Group, a potential listserv for people who attended this webinar, and more information in general about the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning and publishing venues and so forth. And did I cover everything that was necessary?
I think so. We do have the one thing coming out on the LSA website from the editors of Teaching Language. So.
Yep, I'll get that around in an email pretty soon. And the recording of this webinar should be available for anyone who wants it no later than Monday, possibly as soon as late this afternoon. So we'll send around an email when everyone gets that. So again, thank you very much to all of you, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you.